I never imagined my own daughter would throw me out of her mansion with nothing but the clothes I was wearing. "Dad, this house is mine now, and I do not want you here anymore," she said, pointing toward the front door as if I were a stranger. I stood there silently, holding the small suitcase I had packed after she told me we needed to talk. For 12 years, I had helped my daughter, Emily, build the life she had always dreamed about. I had paid for her education, supported her first business, and even helped her purchase the mansion she now proudly called home. But that night, none of it seemed to matter. She looked at me and said, "You have had your time. I want to enjoy my life without you controlling everything." I wanted to remind her that I had never controlled her life, but I knew arguing would change nothing. So I walked outside. The security gate closed behind me, and I stood on the driveway watching the mansion lights glow through the windows. Then my phone rang. It was my attorney, James. "Mr. Harper, where are you?" he asked urgently. I told him what had happened. There was a long silence before he said, "Then I believe it is time we discuss your daughter's inheritance." I stopped walking. "What about it?" I asked. His voice became serious. "Your daughter is scheduled to receive approximately $1.4 billion from the family trust. But according to the conditions your late wife placed in the trust, that money can be frozen if the beneficiary violates one specific condition." I stared back at the mansion. "What condition?" James answered quietly. "She must never use the family fortune to abandon or financially harm an immediate family member." I looked at the front door where my daughter had just thrown me out. For the first time that night, I realized tomorrow morning was going to change her life forever. I spent the night in a small hotel room, unable to sleep. My daughter's words kept replaying in my mind. "I want to enjoy my life without you." I had never expected gratitude from Emily, but I never imagined she would treat me like an unwanted guest in the home I had helped her build. At 6 the next morning, my attorney James arrived with a folder under his arm. He sat across from me and opened it carefully. "Mr. Harper, before we freeze anything, we need to establish exactly what happened last night." I told him everything, from Emily asking me to leave to the security guard walking me through the gate. James listened without interrupting. Then he showed me a copy of the family trust. My late wife, Margaret, had created it years before she passed away. The trust contained a condition I had almost forgotten about. Emily could inherit the $1.4 billion fortune, but only if she continued to treat immediate family members with basic care and respect. "Your wife was worried about this exact situation," James said. I looked at the document and noticed something else. Margaret had added a clause that gave me temporary control over the inheritance if Emily ever tried to remove a family member from her life for financial reasons. "Why would she put that in there?" I asked. James looked at me seriously. "Because she knew your daughter had changed after she became wealthy." I felt a heavy silence settle over the room. I remembered how Emily used to visit me every Sunday, how she once told me that money would never change her. Now she had a mansion, expensive cars, private parties, and almost $1.4 billion waiting for her. James closed the folder and said, "There is one more problem. Emily has already contacted the trustee this morning." I looked at him. "What did she tell them?" He paused before answering. "She told them you were unstable, dangerous, and trying to take her inheritance." I could hardly believe it. Then James placed one final document on the table. "She also requested that you be legally removed from the trust." I looked at the document again, hardly believing that Emily had gone this far. She was not simply angry with me anymore. She was trying to make me look like a threat so she could gain complete control of the $1.4 billion inheritance. James noticed my expression and quietly said, "Do not contact her yet. Let the trust documents speak for themselves." I nodded, but deep inside, I was still hoping my daughter would call and apologize. Instead, my phone began filling with messages from relatives. Emily had already told them that I had become difficult, bitter, and obsessed with her money. She claimed I had threatened to take her mansion away from her. I read every message without responding. Then James received a call from the trustee. He put it on speaker, and the trustee's voice immediately sounded serious. "Mr. Harper, I have reviewed the complaint submitted by your daughter. There is a problem with her request." James asked, "What problem?" The trustee explained that Margaret had placed an unusual protection inside the trust. Before Emily could receive another dollar, the trustee had to investigate any accusation involving a family member, and the person accused had the right to present evidence. I felt a small sense of relief. Then the trustee added something that made me sit upright. "There is also a sealed letter from your late wife that becomes active if Emily attempts to remove you from the trust. My heart began pounding. Margaret had never mentioned such a letter to me. The trustee continued. She instructed us to deliver it to you. Personally, if this situation ever occurred, James looked at me and said, we should go to the trust office today. 2 hours later, we sat across from the trustee as he placed a sealed envelope on the table. My wife's handwriting was unmistakable. I opened it with trembling hands, expecting words of wisdom. Instead, the first sentence made my blood run cold. William, if you are reading this, then Emily has finally done what I feared she would do. I could barely breathe as I continued reading Margaret's letter. She had written it years before, but somehow every sentence felt like she was sitting beside me, warning me about the exact moment I was living through. William, Emily may one day believe that wealth gives her the right to decide who belongs in our family. If that happens, do not fight her with anger. Let the trust protect what we built. I wiped my eyes and kept reading. Margaret explained that she had created the $1.4 billion inheritance not simply to make Emily wealthy, but to make sure the money could never destroy the family. The trust required Emily to pass 3 conditions before receiving full control. She had to protect the family, act honestly, and never use the inheritance to punish someone who depended on her. James looked at the trustee and asked, does throwing her father out of her home violate those conditions? The trustee opened another file. By itself, perhaps not. But we have evidence that Emily did more than ask her father to leave. He slid several photographs across the table. They showed boxes of my belongings sitting outside the mansion, along with documents proving that Emily had ordered my bank access and personal accounts connected to the family trust to be restricted. I stared at the photographs in disbelief. She tried to cut me off financially? The trustee nodded. Yes, and she did it while simultaneously requesting control of the inheritance. James leaned forward. Then the condition has been triggered. The trustee picked up a phone and made one short call. Freeze the distribution immediately. I sat there in silence, realizing that my daughter's $1.4 billion inheritance had just been placed on hold. But before we left, the trustee stopped me and handed me another document. Mr. Harper, your wife left one more instruction. She wanted you to receive this only after the inheritance was frozen. Looked down at the document and saw a single sentence that made my heart race. William, now it is time to show Emily what she was really supposed to inherit. I looked at the document again, confused by Margaret's final words. James opened the attached file and placed it in front of me. Inside was not another inheritance clause, but a list of properties, investments, and charitable foundations worth nearly $600 million. I stared at the numbers in disbelief. Margaret had quietly arranged these assets years before her death, and she had placed them under my control. But there was one condition. I could transfer them to Emily only if she proved that she understood what family meant. James pointed to the final page. Your wife wanted you to give Emily one final opportunity before making any permanent decision. I asked what that meant. He explained that the trust would remain frozen for 30 days, giving Emily time to correct what she had done. During those 30 days, she could apologize, restore my access to my accounts, and publicly withdraw the accusations she had made against me. If she refused, the $1.4 billion would never go directly to her. Instead, it would be transferred into a foundation supporting elderly parents who had been abandoned by their families. I felt tears fill my eyes. Margaret had planned this with incredible care. She had not wanted revenge against our daughter. She wanted Emily to understand that wealth was a responsibility, not a weapon. That afternoon, I returned to the mansion with James. Emily opened the door and immediately began shouting, "What did you do to my inheritance?" I calmly told her the money had been frozen because of the trust conditions. She laughed. "You think you can control me just because Mom left you some paperwork?" I looked at her and said, "No, Emily, your mother is the one who made these rules." Her smile disappeared. Then I handed her the letter Margaret had written for her. Emily read the first few lines, and the anger on her face slowly turned into fear. But before she could finish, she looked at me and whispered, "Dad, there is something Mom never told you." Emily's words stopped me cold. I looked at her, waiting for an explanation, but she could not bring herself to speak. James stepped forward and asked, "What did Margaret never tell your father?" Emily lowered her eyes and finally admitted that, months before her death, Margaret had discovered Emily was planning to sell several family properties after receiving the inheritance. She had also found messages showing that Emily had been discussing the sale with an investment group that wanted to break up the family's assets and sell them for profit. Mom found out? I asked. Emily nodded, tears beginning to fall. She confronted me and I promised I would stop. She said she would protect the family from me if I ever tried it again. I felt a deep sadness rather than anger. My daughter had known exactly why the trust contained those conditions, yet she still tried to remove me from the family and gain control of the money. James asked Emily one final question. Why did you throw your father out? Emily looked at me and whispered, because I thought if Dad was gone, nobody could stop me from getting everything. The confession left the room completely silent. I had spent my entire life protecting my daughter, but she had been willing to destroy me for money she had not even earned. I told her that the inheritance would remain frozen until the trustee made the final decision. Emily began crying and asked me to forgive her. I told her forgiveness would take time, but I would not let money destroy what was left of our family. The next morning, the trustee called me with the final decision. Mr. Harper, the $1.4 billion inheritance has been permanently removed from Emily's personal control. I closed my eyes, expecting to hear that the money would go to charity. Instead, the trustee said something that left me speechless. Your wife changed the entire inheritance plan, and she named you as the person who must decide what happens to every dollar. I sat quietly after hearing the trustee's decision. The $1.4 billion that Emily had expected to control was now under my responsibility, and for the first time, I understood why Margaret had planned everything so carefully. She did not want me to punish our daughter. She wanted me to make sure the money could never become more important than family again. I called Emily and asked her to meet me at the trust office. When she arrived, she looked completely different from the confident woman who had thrown me out of her mansion. She sat across from me crying and said, Dad, I know I ruined everything. I cannot undo what I did, but I am asking you for one more chance. I placed Margaret's letter in front of her. Your mother gave you that chance before she died. You chose money instead. Emily lowered her head. I told her that I would not give her $1.4 billion, but I would give her something far more important, a chance to rebuild her life, without depending on an inheritance. I agreed to restore a modest amount of her trust income, but the rest would be placed into a foundation supporting elderly parents who had been abandoned by their children. Emily accepted the decision through tears. Months later, she sold the mansion, moved into a smaller home, and began working with the foundation. She started visiting elderly people who had been left alone by their families. And slowly, I saw the daughter I remembered returning. One evening, she came to my house carrying an old photograph of Margaret. Dad, she said, I finally understand what Mom was trying to teach me. I smiled and invited her inside. We sat together, looking through old family photographs. And for the first time in years, there was no discussion about money. Margaret's plan had worked. She had protected our family from a fortune that could have destroyed it. I learned that night that sometimes the greatest inheritance is not money at all. It is the lesson that teaches us what truly matters before we lose everything that money can never replace.